At the beginning of next year, Boston will have for the first time a city council with a majority of women and people of color. Much of the change results from the November 5th election, including the vote for the first person of color to be a councilor in District 5, which includes Hyde Park and most of Rosendale and Mattapan. We'd like to welcome the councilor-elect, Ricardo Arroyo.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, and congratulations.
Thank you.
Ricardo, I want to start with the tone of this, because at your Victory Night celebration, everybody knew it was historic. You said it was historic, but for you, historic meant a lot of continuity too, didn't it?
I guess. I mean, for me, I grew up in the district. I grew up in Hyde Park, and the Hyde Park that I grew up in was very different than the Hyde Park that my parents moved into in 1980. And so for me, this was sort of a continuation of seeing the changing face of Hyde Park that looks more reflective, really, of the direction that the city's gone. You know, it's more immigrant, there's more people of color. I think right now the makeup of the district is 75% people of color, right? So it's historic, it's a big deal, but it's also sort of a continuation of the direction that the city's been going in.
What I also noticed comparing this year with 2013, just the makeup of the people who were running for city council. I think 6 years ago it was still overwhelmingly white, not completely white. This year, quite different.
I was very impressed with the field. I mean, I obviously was running a race, so I was very focused on ours. But as I looked at the other district seats, as I looked at the at-large field, I was very impressed with the representation that was reflected in the candidates that had chosen to run.
Of course, when you did your Victory Night speech, you had different people from different communities in the district. What were you thinking about behind that?
So one of the things that I had heard, unfortunately, during the campaign was some people would say, you know, how do you think you're going to do in Hyde Park? How do you think you're going to do in these parts of the neighborhoods? And what I had started to realize is that for a large portion of folks who either are new to District 5 or haven't been in District 5, they don't realize that District 5 has had folks who've lived in that district for 30, 40 years who are either of Haitian descent or Latino descent or African American. And so what I wanted to make sure was reflected there was that this district has for a very long time incorporated all of these different cultures and people and races, and that they had a voice now and that they were represented. So when people said things like, you know, how are you going to do in Hyde Park, because they think that Hyde Park looks more like the elected leadership that we've had from there in the past, when it's actually much more diverse than that they would have a frame of reference for why that was always a surprising question for me in terms of just the makeup of what this community looks like.
Well, of course, you're the third Arroyo in this family to win an election, but you're doing something different from the other two. You ran for a district seat.
Yes, none of them have done that. That's my first. And so I did that because of two things. One, I believed it was really important to represent my home neighborhood. I thought there was a place there for them to have a progressive voice that was more reflective of the direction that the neighborhoods had been going in for quite some time, and I didn't think was being shown by their representative at the District 5 City Council spot, currently the incumbent, but also because I see the city council as a body. It's a body of 13 people, and in order to pass any kinds of ordinances, you need 7 votes. And so I saw this as an opportunity to flip a vote from what was once a conservative seat to now a progressive seat, and I saw that as more of a citywide power shift.
And this goes back to when you decided, because I think you made that decision before Tim McCarthy said he was
I challenged him as an incumbent, yes.
Why did you want to do that?
So I knew at the time, and you know, it had nothing at the time to do with him as a person. It had a lot to do with the policies that he had been pushing. At the time, the Jim Brooks Act, which was a housing bill, all it was going to do was track evictions. He had voted against that in a district where over 60% of people who pay rent are paying 60% of their rent, of their monthly income to rent. That felt like a misstep when he backed Charlie Baker in a district that has immigrants, a large immigrant population, about 40% immigrant population, and Charlie Baker has some pretty poor policies on immigration. I saw all those things as a reason to really challenge that and make sure that the district was represented with a more progressive voice and had a more progressive option.
What's also interesting in this district is almost like a tale of two worlds here, because you have this high percentage of home ownership among people of color, but you also have renters, lots of displacement pressure along that rail corridor. What do you want to do about that?
So one of the things that I think is really crucial, and one of the things that I'm going to be focusing on a lot of my time, is I believe that the way we counter displacement is by actually creating home ownership opportunities for folks who are currently rent burdened. And so looking at ways that we can start to try and fund that municipally, or working with the state legislature to make sure that we're making pathways to creating home ownership opportunities, because part of the issue with this is I don't own a home. For me to own a home, that seems a little far-fetched. stretched, right? Because when we're talking about market rate housing in that district, a home that my mother purchased in 1980 for about $50,000 is now about $500,000. That's market rate, that's not luxury. But $500,000 for the average Bostonian and the average resident in that district is market rate, is actually luxury. That's actually a luxury expense. And so the only way we're going to actually counter some of that development displacement is if the homes that they're building are not necessarily to provide housing for folks who don't currently live in the district, but to provide home ownership opportunities for people who do currently live in the district but are currently rent burdened or unable to leave their parents' home or whatever the situation may be. And so my focus is going to be on creating pathways to home ownership for residents of District 5.
Where do you see the potential here as far as the new makeup of the council around housing? Because we heard a lot about rent control. Is it really that particular solution, or are we talking about some other things that might be working into the equation?
So the way that I see the housing, and as I do it a lot, I compare it a lot to my student loans. And so my student loans are enormous. I went to the law schools and I had to do a lot of that through student loans. And so when people talk about the interest rate on my student loans, that's always sort of a temporary band-aid. That doesn't solve the dilemma that I have, which is that the loan is too high to pay. So when we talk about rent and we talk about capping the rent and stabilizing rent by rent control measures, we're still talking about people who are paying at the upper limits of what their rent they can afford to pay with their rent. And so that's a temporary solution in my eyes. That's not a permanent solution. That's not something that actually solves kind of the housing burden that so many people have, which is why so much of my focus is going to be on trying to figure out ways to take rent burden people who may be paying $1,800, $1,900 a month up to $2,000, $2,200 a month on rent and making them pay considerably less on mortgages. The fact of the matter is most mortgages are considerably less than the rents that we pay in the city right now. And so if we can create a program or some way to create home ownership where we give loans similar to the way the federal government gives loans to first-time home buyers, provided they bring the down payment, I'd like to reverse that and see if we can provide a way to provide a down payment loan to families that otherwise could not save money, because when you're paying that much for rent, you can't create savings, and then putting them into homes, which I think would reverse a lot of those trends. It would also do something about there's a lot of talk, I've talked about it certainly a lot, about the net worth for a white family is $250,000, the net worth for a black family is about $8. And the large difference there is who owns property and who doesn't. And so making sure we act on that is something that I think we're gonna have to do. I do think rent policies are important, but also remedying that situation is gonna require getting folks out of being rent burdened for essentially for life.
This is BNN News. We're talking with Ricardo Arroyo, Boston City Councilor-elect for District 5. Ricardo, I also want to go back to your legal background, because one of the other things that's been noted about people who are vulnerable to eviction is most of them don't have lawyers. Is there something that needs to be done about that?
So the right to counsel, which I believe is currently going through the State House, I'm a full proponent for. I think that it's an important measure and something that has to happen. I believe that the mayor has spoken in favor of having right to counsel for folks who are facing eviction, and I would support that.
I want to go back to how you got elected in terms of how you campaign. What kind of an organization? I mean, did you have this broad support from the community feeding into it? So
the big thing about the district is that it's Hyde Park, Mattapan, and Rosendale, and that it's a multilingual, multi-generational, immigrant-rich community. And so what we did from the very first day is we made sure that our campaign was multilingual. We had the three major languages in the district are Haitian Creole, Spanish, and English. We made sure that we had literature in all three languages. We made sure we approached every community, that we engaged as many people as we could on the doors, and that required hundreds of volunteers. And so it was a pretty large effort. I also wonder about the effect of other races in other candidacies this year, and I noticed that especially on social media. You got some support from people like Michelle Wu, and you had two Latino candidates running at large who had vigorous campaigns. Did that make a difference in this election? I was proud to vote for actually the three names you said, the two Latina candidates, Alejandra Senkian and Julia Mejia, as well as Michelle Wu, and I think that there's a wave in the sense that we understand that if we want to make the kind of changes that we're talking about, which are substantive changes in the daily lives of our residents, it's going to require more than one individual. It's going to require sort of a team of folks. And so I saw this campaign, I saw some of that synergy with at-large candidates where folks were trying to essentially lift up the community and say, this isn't just about me, this is also about having partners at the table who are looking at these kind of problems and trying to figure out in a way that we can work in a coordinated fashion to address them. Thank you very much for being with us. Thank you. Ricardo Arroyo, the City Councilor-elect for District 5. Thank you for having me. In a moment, we'll hear about a group working for businesses in the Black community. But first, this message.